Chapter 17. It was the dream honeymoon, a transatlantic cruise with the love of her life. She never tired of looking at her new husband's face, and knew that she never would. They had been at sea for just over a day. Everywhere she looked, she saw water. It was glorious, exactly where she wanted to be, how she wanted to spend her first days as a married woman. The weather had cooperated, too. That had been a concern when booking the trip. October can be a mixed bag. So far, so good. It was the dead of night. She and her new husband had spent the day by the pool. After dinner, they did a little gambling at the ship's casino before hitting the bar for a few drinks. Then the emotions took over. After the ship's bar closed, they headed back to their cabin and began tearing each other's clothes off. They were on a mission to get pregnant as fast as possible. She couldn't wait to be a mother. They couldn't wait to be parents. The lights were off, but she could still see his outline in the shadows, make out every feature on his handsome face. She closed her eyes so she could just live in the moment, embrace the pleasure. Then everything stopped. The sensation ceased. The sound shut off. It was as if all the oxygen had been yanked out of her. Then the sound returned, but it wasn't the sound of her new husband huffing and puffing. It was a mix of human commotion and machinery. When she opened her eyes, she was blinded by the brightness, both from natural light streaming in through the windows and man-made fluorescent light illuminating the train car. She was in a train car, a packed one. What the hell is happening? She thought. The disorientation was overwhelming. She looked around and was greeted by bewildered faces. Their expression mirrored how she was feeling, confusion and fear. She looked at her hands, but they sure as hell weren't her hands. They were a man's hands. They began to tremble. Her chest began to feel as if it were crumbling like an aluminum can. She couldn't breathe. Her head was swimming. The world was spinning. She needed off the train, and she wasn't the only one. As realization of what was happening rippled through the passengers, their collective chaos began to multiply exponentially. People were flying out of their seats and clawing at each other. It was mass confusion, mixed with panic. Chaos was the result. Heather couldn't breathe. Her chest continued to crush her lungs. With every last ounce of energy she had, she pulled herself up from her seat and began fighting her way through the aisle. Lucky for her, her new body was strong. Anyone who got in her way soon found themselves out of her way. She could see the door that separated her car from the next. It was only about 15 feet away. Between it and her was a mass of people. Without thinking, she began throwing wild haymakers. Had she been coherent enough to feel pain, she would have noticed 3 of the fingers on her right hand breaking as they connected with someone's skull. 10 feet from the door, it opened and spewed out a large, blonde-headed man. He barreled toward her, but she was too lost in her panic to comprehend the situation and move. All she saw was another obstacle between her and the door. Without thinking, she whipped her right hand and its 3 broken fingers back in preparation to bring down upon the man who was moving within striking distance. She unleashed her right fist and sent it flying toward the blond man, but it never got there. He blocked it with his left arm, and before Heather's instincts could react, the blond man's right hand smashed into her face. Her eye caught a glimpse of the metal, but had been unable to register it before it punctured right through. Suddenly all the pain she had been unable to feel overcame her body. No more paralyzing and punishing than the piece of metal jammed deep into her eye socket, too deep, then ripped out. The blond man was already past her as she fell to the ground, blood gushing from the hole where her new eye had just been. Her mind remained cloudy with panic and confusion as the life drained from her body. With her one good eye, she unleashed one final tear before shutting it forever. Chapter 18. She was already regretting the decision. When the founder asked for volunteers, she should have kept quiet. Instead, she raised her hand. She was the only one. If she were being honest, she expected everyone to raise their hands, and for someone else to be chosen. After all, doing a personal favor for the founder was a privilege. Yet for some reason, no one was interested in this privilege, so it was on her. Leaving Newcastle was nothing new for Meg. Being someone who jumped into the body of a young, strong, and fit man, She had spent more than a decade putting her inherited body to work, a loyal servant of Newcastle. She wasn't an original Newcastleian. She had been part of the first wave of new residents, one of the 11 found by scouts in their first year of scouting, a day she would never forget. Until then, she and the small group she had wound up with after the great mix-up had been using the collective size and strength of their new bodies to survive. But they weren't organized. Newcastle gave them a foundation to build upon, something to believe in and work toward instead of simply fighting to live day by day. Since then, she had poured her life into turning the settlement into territory it had become. Her strong body had been used to build, scout, scavenge, defend, and breed. Of all the things she had done for Newcastle, the most difficult had been breeding. Using a man's body to breed with someone in a woman's body never felt natural for her. Nothing about being in a man's body felt natural for her, even after 15 years. It was one thing to use the body to carry heavy things. It was another to use it for procreation. But the show had to go on. The very strong, fit, and useful body she now called home made for an ideal breeder. By that point, she had 7 healthy children to her resume, all from different partners, none romantic. That was how it was. You did what was necessary to rebuild. Just doing my part. Some people did manage to find true love in the new world, but it was rare. One might be attracted to the body of a handsome young man, only to find that it housed the mind of a racist old woman. These types of mismatches were painfully common, and made it very difficult for many to find the right combination of bodies and minds that synced up just right. People like Meg, who had found themselves in bodies they could never feel truly at home in and resigned themselves to life free from love. As a result, organized breeding was a necessary evil that everyone needed to participate in. This new task was something different, something big. Meg was being sent northeast into the unknown to help the first pureborn track down the notorious serial killer known as the Skinner. Why the kid was so passionate about tracking the Skinner down was a mystery, privileged information. Only the kid, the founder, and presumably the parent knew. All Meg knew was that word had reached Newcastle. The detective who had been in pursuit of the notorious killer had been slain, found hanging from a tree outside the territory of a settlement called Watersway. Now the kid was determined to pick up the detective's mantle, finish the job. Everyone had been opposed to it. The pureborn had been a protected citizen since being born in the earliest days of Newcastle, shortly after his pregnant parent arrived, but he was old enough to make his own decisions now. The parent had always been of great interest to Meg. He lived in one of the nicest and largest suites in the former hotel turned settlement. In the early days, he briefly worked the fields, often with young pureborn at his side. But as Newcastle's population grew, the parent faded into the background, retreating to his suite to live in quiet isolation. He never attended meetings, meals, or social gatherings. Everywhere where there were people, the parent could not be found. Meg would have loved nothing more than to get a look inside the parent's suite, to see how this person had been spending all their years in self-imposed isolation. But the room was off limits. Only the founder and the pureborn were ever allowed inside, not even cleaning crews. From what Meg knew, the parent only left his suite for 2 purposes, the first being to eat, usually alone or with either the founder, the pureborn, or both. The other was to work out in Newcastle's fitness center. It was nothing more than a typical hotel gym. Just about every capital resident worked out there from time to time, except 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. every single day when it was closed for the parents' private workouts. This never caused any issues since the rest of the population was working at that time. Most did their workouts either early in the morning or in the evening. Most residents learned to act as if the parent didn't exist. No one bothered the pureborn with questions. This was partially because it had been decreed by the founder that the parent had special privileges and was not to be bothered, nor was the topic to be brought up to the pureborn. After a while, most simply forgot about the parent. It was as if he was invisible. The truth was that everyone saw him. They just pretended not to. Meg's interest in the parent went beyond his strange and unique standing within Newcastle and all the privileges it afforded. Whom his body had originally belonged to was what really drew Meg to him. Once upon a time, Meg had known the original inhabitant, back in the old world. In those days, the parent's body had belonged to Cecilia Chesterfield Carmichael, socialite and heiress to one of London's oldest and most influential families. Meg hadn't exactly been friends with her, but they had both been born into London's old money upper class. As a result, they had gone to the same private schools and traveled in the same circles since Meg's childhood. Seeing that familiar body dressed in ways that the original inhabitant would have never allowed always gave Meg pause. Not to mention the missing teeth and general air of sadness that always wafted off him. The parent was so shrouded in mystery that no one even knew the name of the person inhabiting Cecilia's body. All Meg knew was that it was the mind of a man. That was common knowledge. She could also tell by the way he awkwardly operated the body, but that was all she knew about him. That was the strangest aspect of the parent to Meg, the way he moved. The new inhabitant carried none of the grace or elegance that the body was supposed to move with. The new inhabitant was clearly someone used to lumbering and stomping around, a far cry from the model of sophistication that Cecilia had been. The parent had shown up with a large caravan from the north while pregnant with a pureborn at the tail end of the first winter. Many of the new residents who came with that caravan had barely survived waking up in what used to be the United Kingdom. What they saw and experienced traumatized them. There were two members of the caravan in particular who had arrived extremely traumatized, the parent and the teacher. Both had difficult times adjusting to life in the new world. The teacher also lived a largely private life of isolation, but at least she contributed to the settlement as a teacher. Even though the parent only spoke with the founder upon arrival and spent most of his time tending to the pureborn, everyone knew the source of the trauma. They didn't need the parent to confirm it, since it was obvious. It was almost time. She finished lacing up her boots, her best and most intact pair, the ones she saved for special missions. Newcastle had a stockpile of boots that had been scavenged from stores, homes, and warehouses. The supply was carefully managed and rationed. Everyone was expected to stretch the life of their boots and shoes as long as possible. Lucky for Meg, she had managed to find a few pairs that fit her on dead bodies in the wild. Those were fair game. Finders keepers. As far as weapons, she had her trusty 9mm and her even more trusty M16. Each had saved her and others countless times over the years. She also had 2 knives. The pureborn would be armed as well. He'd been trained since childhood and could be trusted to hold his own. Meg felt like he probably could have gone alone, even at his age, but he was too important. Both the founder and the parent wanted someone trustworthy to go with and keep an eye on him. The parent had requested it. The founder had acquiesced, like he always did. They would be traveling to Water's Way as part of a necked caravan, passengers in someone else's carriage. The caravan was to be in Water's Way 48 hours. The plan was to see the detective's body, question anyone who may have information, then ride out with the caravan and either ride back to Old Glory to spend the winter in the Net capital or get dropped off somewhere else where they would wait until spring and word of new Skinner activity. Then they would really get to work. She did one final check on her supplies. Everything was good to go. She left her room, locking the door behind her. As she always did while locking the door before heading out on a mission that could result in her death, she clutched the locked doorknob and pressed her forehead against the door. With her eyes closed, she let her mind go blank for approximately 10 seconds. This was how she centered herself and calmed her nerves. It had been working for more than a decade. She hoped it would work once more. Once she was done, she made her way to the courtyard where the founder, the pureborn, and the teacher were all waiting. The presence of the teacher was the only surprise. Meg shot her a suspicious look and clocked the papers clutched in her right hand while crutches propped under each arm kept her upright. "Letters from L, the detective. Thought you might want to see 'em." She held them out, and Meg took them. "Last one's most important," said the teacher. "Talks about a plan he thinks should work next time the killer pops up." Meg quietly read the letters, taking special note of the detective's plan to smoke the Skinner out of hiding. She handed them back to the teacher. "Don't want to keep 'em?" asked the teacher. "No, but the part about the plan is very helpful. Thank you for sharing." The teacher nodded, then folded the letters back up and put them in her pocket. She then put her hands on the crutches. "Safe journey, both of you." Meg nodded, and the pureborn said nothing as the teacher spun on her crutches and began crutching away. We should probably get moving soon, thought Meg. Ready? The pureborn nodded as the founder approached Meg. Even after all these years, the sight of the angelic face that had once belonged to A-list movie star Trent Steele briefly stole her breath. It had aged like a fine wine under the founder's watch. If only Meg had jumped into the body of a woman, she might have been able to do more than try not to stare. After all, by this point, she and the founder had become dear friends. Yet there weren't many faces in the world like Trent Steele's, not in the old world nor the new. He stuck his hand out. She shook it. Godspeed, my friend. See you soon. Counting on it. It was just after dawn. By sunset, they would be further from Newcastle than the pureborn had been since he was born. They were prepared to go as far as it took. Before all the scavenging, before all the fighting, before all the killing, before all the surviving, before Newcastle, the Skinner and the great mix-up, before all this, there was just Meg, and life was good for Meg. Like Cecilia Chesterfield Carmichael, Meg Elizabeth Davenport had been a young socialite from London, heiress to a vast, deep-rooted fortune. Her childhood had been spent with every advantage her family's wealth could make available. She was 18 when everything got mixed up. In year 13 of sixth form at the finest preparatory school in England. It was the same school that Cecilia had once attended. Cecilia had been older by 5 years and had since graduated into adulthood, but everyone knew who she was. Even so, Meg's parents were friends with Cecilia's, so Meg had been around her plenty while growing up. Due to their age difference, however, their interactions rarely went beyond pleasantries. Upon graduation, Meg was bound for the United States to receive an Ivy League education, something she had dreamt of since she was a child. This, of course, never happened. She had always been fascinated with America, despite having never been anywhere other than New York and Los Angeles. As far as Meg was concerned, they were the only cities worth her time. After the great mix-up, a part of her always wished she had woken up in the body of someone on the other side of the pond. She often considered making the trip back to Portstown and the journey across the Atlantic. But what was the point in that? What was over there now was far from the America she had once been so fascinated with. Instead of jumping into someone in America, she woke up in the body of an approximately 16-year-old boy in Italy. Despite still being a teenage body, it was a hell of a body. Once things started to settle, she couldn't help admiring her new housing. She would have preferred to have been one of the lucky ones to jump into a familiar body. Remaining a woman would have been ideal. But if she was going to be stuck in a guy's body, it could have been a lot worse. He had been a rugby player. This was clear from the way his room was decorated, as well as his supremely fit physique. The body she woke up in was lying in bed in a small town about 20 kilometers away from where Newcastle was soon to be founded. She remained in that small town until the scouts arrived and invited her to Newcastle. She had been a loyal citizen ever since. The corpse was badly decomposed, but there was still enough of his face left for the pureborn to confirm it was the detective who had come through Newcastle some months earlier. He had been shot in the knee as well as twice through the heart, then strung up. No signs of torture or mutilation, said Meg. Must have got close, said the kid. Meg nodded. Yeah, this is a message. Once they had seen enough, the body was covered and would later be burned. It had been found hanging upside down from a tree a few miles south of Watersway, a peaceful but rather isolationist settlement northeast of the GNT. Meg felt somewhat strange about being there. She had heard plenty about Watersway over the years, mostly talk at the inn, conversations with travelers and traders. She never thought she would visit. Not only were they isolationist, they were all well beyond Newcastle's standard trade radius. Anything that may have been acquired from them or sent to them would have gone through an intermediary such as Cannon or the Net. Watersway was so wary of outsiders that Meg and the pureborn had not even been allowed in. They met with a group of representatives outside of the boundaries who showed them the body. One of the representatives was a woman who had recently lost her husband to the Skinner. The sorrow in her eyes nearly broke Meg. Meg tried to interview the woman, but she didn't know anything. Her husband went out one night and never came home, leaving her to raise their 5 pureborn children. She hadn't even seen the body. probably for the best. The representatives also confirmed that none of the detective's notes had been found on his person. His carriage had been set ablaze. The notes likely went with it. Everything he knew about the Skinner had died with him. Well, almost everything. While at Watersway, he had worked with a guide who shadowed his every move. The guide told Meg and the pureborn everything she remembered. None of it was much help. Mostly descriptions of the bodies and how the detective had approached his investigation. "Didn't say a lot," said the guide. "Kept to himself for the most part." "Know where he was going?" asked the pureborn. The guide nodded. "Brave. Said he was going to hole up for winter until there was activity. Apparently that was his favorite place to spend winters. Something about a hotel, I guess." "Any other bodies since?" The guide shook her head. The pureborn looked at Meg. "Sounds like his M.O. Does his thing in the summer. Disappears in winter. That's what we should do." There was a chill beginning to stir itself into the early October air. But they still had some time before winter, as Meg was quick to point out. "Doesn't matter," said the pureborn. "If there's one constant, it's that he operates on a rough schedule. Spring until he feels like stopping, sometimes late summer, sometimes early fall. Sometimes he pushes it a bit, but once he goes quiet, stays that way through winter." Meg had no idea that the kid knew so much about this notorious serial killer. The carriage ride had been nearly silent. It was only now dawning on her that she should probably learn a bit more about the case since they were picking up the detective's investigation. "We should hold up for the winter, too," said the pureborn. "I'm thinking Brave, not Old Glory. Maybe we can talk to some people who knew the detective, and they can fill in some blanks." That feeling of regret once again set in. Why had she volunteered? She took the job knowing she would have to spend the winter away from Newcastle for the first time since settling there. But the realization hadn't really set in until that moment. One winter, she told herself. If catching the Skinner was what it was going to take to make the kid happy and get her home, then that's what she was going to do. They would go to Brave. It was only a 2 to 3 days ride south and conveniently on the Netk caravan's route. They would spend the winter learning everything they could. Then, once they got word of Skinner activity, they would do what the detective couldn't. She was often haunted by the life she should have lived, the life left behind in the wake of the great mix-up. She knew she wasn't alone, and that everyone who had made it through and was still breathing had also missed out. But she also knew that for some, it was for the better. The old who got young, the unhealthy who got healthy, the weak who got strong, the powerless who became powerful. Even though her new existence was far from bad, she really wanted to live her true life. And why not? She had it all. And the universe, by some cruel twist of fate, had seen fit to take it away. The thoughts kept her up at night, even so many years later. Where would she be right now? What would she be doing? Who would she have married? Would she have children? How many? The types of things she had been fortunate enough to have the luxury of caring about in her old life. Far from the manual labor, scavenging, violence, and loveless breeding she had endured in the New World. She wondered about the why of it all. Why had this happened? What was the meaning of it? Was there a point? Was it just random? In the old world she hadn't been sure if she believed in a heaven or a hell. She still wasn't sure. But she hoped there was something or someone waiting for her when she eventually died. Someone who could give her answers. She also hoped that when she died, if she did go somewhere, that she'd get her damn body back. She had been sleeping in her dorm when things changed over. Went to bed in her old body, woke up in her new one. Thought she was dreaming. With her boarding school being in London, there was a strong likelihood that her real body was long dead, likely already decomposed beyond recognition, a pile of bones mixed in with the rest of the rubble. The thought made her cry. It had been a cold winter in Brave, but she was surprised at just how much she enjoyed spending those months away from home, cozy in the detective suite at Hotel Jojo. The old tourist in her would have preferred to spend winter only a few hours' ride away in New Bavaria. As a fan of their ale, Meg would have liked to visit the source. She had hated beer in the old world, but her new body's taste buds rather enjoyed it. Brave was the next best thing to New Bavaria. They were famous allies who traded freely amongst themselves without net interference. The thing that didn't dawn on her until they got settled at Hotel Jojo was that she had no responsibilities to brave like she did Newcastle. There was always work to be done back home. She was always needed for something, whether by the founder or someone else. During her winter in Brave, she had just one responsibility, and she dedicated herself to it. First, the kid told her everything he knew about the case, beginning with a physical description of the Skinner straight from the teacher. Learning the reason why the teacher had been such a wreck when she arrived in Newcastle gave Meg a newfound understanding of the woman. Who wouldn't be traumatized after experiencing that? Meg and the pureborn met and interviewed everyone in town who might know anything and learned what they knew. Primarily, people of status, leadership, and law enforcement, the kinds of people who would have been friendly with the detective. This included Brett, the innkeeper at Hotel Jojo. He had been friends with the detective and spent many nights discussing the case over ale. Sadly, the detective had never gone into too great detail regarding the intricacies of his investigation. The Skinner had once spent a summer in the area, so everyone in Brave was familiar with his work on some level. Those who met with Meg and the pureborn told them everything they knew, which wasn't much. Most of it was reinforcement of what they already knew. He mutilated bodies, carved out eyes, skinned their faces, showed up in the spring and went dormant for winter, never spending a season in the same place twice. Those who were friends with the detective had been sad to learn of his death. "Good guy," said one of the locals. "Wish I could have had another ale with him." Eventually, winter turned to spring, and word made its way to Brave that the Skinner had begun his new season. He was in the east, near a settlement called Mount Hope, that was in what was once Poland and nowhere near any mountains. The last thing Meg wanted was to venture even further from Newcastle, but Mount Hope was where the Skinner had chosen to spend the season. Therefore, Mount Hope was where she and the pureborn were heading. Instead of the comfort and security of the NETC caravan, they rode horseback to Mount Hope. Riskier option considering the distance and that they were heading into unfamiliar and potentially unfriendly territory, but far faster. Also, their only option as Mount Hope was outside of Netk territory. Therefore, a caravan ride was not possible, even if the Netk had a vested interest in the case. Luckily, the Bravians were sympathetic to the cause and provided two of their finest horses along with the security detail. 20 soldiers from the Brave militia accompanied them both for protection and support. The militia members had been ordered to remain with Meg and the pureborn in Mount Hope until the mission was complete. Aside from fighting off a weak band of raiders, they arrived 3 days after a hard riding. It would have taken close to 10 via carriage. The locals were surprisingly friendly and quite religious. Apparently not one but two preachers woke up in the area when things changed over. When they found each other, they teamed up and united tens, then hundreds, and eventually thousands under the word of God. Religious cults weren't as common in the New World as one might expect. Something that was common in post-apocalyptic fiction in the Old World had not materialized in the New. Meg had encountered a handful of wannabe prophets and startup cults over the years. For the most part, they were always in small numbers, not much of a threat, and kept moving. There was one back around the 7th year that gave everyone in Newcastle unpleasant vibes. They refused to leave the area or stop harassing Newcastleians, so Henry ordered a squad that included Meg to handle them. It wasn't pretty, but it had to be done. It took longer to bury them than it had to handle them. A serial killer, especially of such viciousness, had sent waves of terror through the Mount Hope community. They were desperate for answers. When they got word that 2 outsider experts on the Skinner and some trained soldiers were coming to help, they praised the Lord. The settlement wasn't as isolationist as most. They were careful and protective, but willing to allow people in on the chance of saving them. This was one instance, however, when they had no interest in preaching to their visitors. Meg, the pureborn, and their military escort were there for one reason: get the Skinner. 6 Mount Hopians had already fallen victim. None of the crime scenes remained intact. By the time the 4th body showed up, and they knew what they were dealing with, the settlement's police force requested and were granted permission to use some of the settlement's limited film supply to take photos. It was the first time either Meg or the pureborn had seen some of the Skinner's real work. The pureborn had seen some things growing up in this world, but nothing like this. The detective didn't count, since his death had been practical and lacked the theatricality of traditional Skinner killings. Meg had been through it during her years serving Newcastle. She'd seen and done things her old self could never have dreamt of, but what the Skinner was doing to people was on a different level. She didn't want to wait for another body to turn up, nor did she want to set a trap like Mount Hope's police chief was pushing for. Instead, she wanted to do the thing the detective hadn't been able to do for far too long, the thing he had written to the one-legged teacher about in his final letter. Search, get out past the safety of the walls, and hunt the bastard down like the rat he is. James and his Waters Way team had found where the Skinner had been holed up, only after he had left. According to the emissaries they had met with during their short Waters Way visit, it was clear that the Skinner had stayed there throughout the entirety of his visit. It stood to reason that somewhere a few miles beyond the boundary of Mount Hope was a similar campground, and they were going to find it. They were all set to get to work bright and early in the next morning, but were interrupted by the news of a new body, a young girl, pureborn, the Skinner's favorite type of target in recent years. Once pureborns started getting old enough to wander off on their own, he liked to target them. They were easy to spot due to their youth. By the 15th year if you were young, you were pureborn. Easy enough. Everything about the Skinner sickened Meg. None more than his love of torturing, sexually assaulting, and murdering people in their younger bodies. Especially pureborns. There were a lot of bad people roaming the world, hiding in new bodies in the wake of the Great Mix-Up. When it came to true monsters, as far as Meg was concerned, there was the Skinner, then everyone else. Meg didn't need long at the crime scene. It wasn't like they had a forensics team or a crime lab, and she hadn't been a detective in the old world, so she had no knowledge of how to work a crime scene. Once she had seen enough, she told the pureborn they should get to work on the search. He agreed. Mount Hope was one of the larger settlements Meg had seen in the New World. Many people. Plenty of resources. They were kind enough to spare whatever was needed of each. Just over 200 people joined Meg, the pureborn, and the members of the brave militia to form a search party, all fully armed. Meg observed all of Mount Hope's military-grade firepower and couldn't help asking the police chief where it came from. He reminded her that before the mix-up, there had been a war going on to the east, something she had long forgotten about. After all, the struggles of others, especially foreigners, had mattered not to someone with her privileged life. But there had been a war going on in what was then Eastern Europe. It turned out that a large portion of Mount Hope's population had wandered west from that direction to join Mount Hope. After waking up amid the chaos of the war in the east, many people who had jumped into bodies there grouped up and headed west, hoping to find greener pastures. They eventually found their way to Mount Hope. After meeting with the preachers, and seeing what the settlement had to offer, they told them of what existed back where they came from. The preachers sent a team back with the new arrivals to recruit more citizens and scavenge all the military gear they could get their hands on. It took multiple trips, but the settlement managed to secure quite possibly the largest armory in all of what used to be Europe. It had come in handy over the years. Despite their vast firepower, Mount Hope had no interest in expanding. They were never the aggressors. They only used their power to defend themselves and their land. Thank God they're peaceful, thought Meg. While heading north to some nearby ruins, Meg wondered if the Skinner had any idea what kind of firepower was awaiting him in Mount Hope. No one knew if he did much scouting of the areas he hunted in or if he simply chose them at random. The only thing close to a certainty was that he never hunted in the same area twice. He liked to move around. There were 6 sets of ruins within range of Mount Hope without being too close nor too far. Everyone agreed that they were the most likely hideouts for the Skinner. As a result, the search party had broken off into 6 teams. Meg and the pureborn led the 20 members of the brave militia to the ruins to the north. The police chief believed them the most likely place for the Skinner to choose for his campground. The chief and 4 of his best officers joined Meg's squad as guides and to round out their numbers. In the old world, the ruins had been a small village up on a hill. It wasn't uncommon for scavengers, raiders, and travelers to hole up in any of the nearby ruins from time to time. Mount Hope kept watch on all 6 of them. The one to the north was always the most active. Of the 6, it was most intact, Plus, it was on a hill with a clear 360-degree view of the surrounding area, easier to see threats approaching. Mount Hope wasn't keen on having unknown people in the area. When any type of traveler took up residence in a nearby ruin, they were monitored from a safe distance for 72 hours. If they did not pack up and move on, a party was sent to greet them and convince them to move on, by force if necessary. Having been to each ruin on multiple occasions, the police chief believed the one to the north to be the most ideal for someone of the Skinner's caliber to feel safe and hidden while terrorizing the settlement. It seemed curious to Meg, for all their watching of the nearby ruins, no one from Mount Hope had seen the Skinner take up residence nearby. Then again, he was known to be nocturnal. Perhaps he understood how to use the darkness to his advantage better than most. The pureborn had suggested splitting up from Meg, but she reminded him that the entire reason she was there was to watch over him. Where he went, she went. As the ruins to the north got closer, Meg became increasingly confident that the Skinner would be dead by day's end. Meg, the pureborn, the police chief, and the militia tore the ruins apart. They kept in radio contact with the other search parties who did the same with the other ruins. No one was finding anything. He's smart, Meg reminded everyone. Not just going to drop his stuff and hole up anywhere. Gotta dig. They did. They left no stone unturned. And that was how they found him. The pureborn was more determined than anyone to find the Skinner. He never told Meg what was driving him so hard. Something more than just a sense of duty. That much she was certain of. It was personal. He would never admit it, but he didn't have to. She could tell. It was all over his face, and in his body language. Meg initially assumed it had to do with the teacher. After all, she had been the one to witness the Skinner's work in the early days. She and the pureborn were close after years of her teaching him. It seemed logical that he wanted to avenge her. But the more Meg observed of his behavior, the more she was convinced that there was more to him than he was letting on. The situation was looking bleak. Word was coming over the radio that no one had found anything. There didn't seem to be any stone left to turn over. The pureborn just refused to give up. He's here. I just know it. Members of the brave militia were losing hope and wanted to head back, but the pureborn convinced them to just stay a little longer. Then he saw it. On the other side of the hill, just outside of the ruins, hidden from the watchful eyes of Mount Hope scouts, a forest. But through the trees he could see what looked to be a structure of some sort. The pureborn rounded up the brave militia and led the way with Meg and the police chief at his side. They slowly made their way through the trees while trying their best to remain quiet. Before they even reached the clearing, Meg realized she was looking at a cabin, a very old cabin that was on its last legs. But even if it was only barely standing, it was still standing. She pointed at the cabin, then spun her index finger around to signal that the militia should surround it. Within minutes, all the windows were covered by a militia member, while Meg, the pureborn, the police chief, and the rest of the militia prepared to enter via the cabin's only door. Meg thought about kicking the door in. Instead, she tried the knob, and it turned. Why would anyone bother to lock a door out here? The inside looked like a place that had been cleared in the early days of the New World. Since then, it hadn't been touched in some time, until some very recent changes. A pile of fresh animal carcasses in one corner, and an assortment of well-used knives spread across one of the tables. Years of killing had stained all the blades a deep rust color. In one of the other corners was a very old bed with a mattress that looked like it would give you cancer if you touched it. Atop the rotten mattress, a very large, muscular man's body slept peacefully. It was no surprise to see him sound asleep. He did his work at night, then got out of sight, and slept during the day. Meg quietly approached the sleeping man while the others followed. From approximately 3 feet away, she observed him. The body was in the early to mid-40s, give or take. Both arms were covered with faded full sleeves of tattoos, just as he had been described by the teacher. That was when it hit Meg. She knew this man. Well, not this man, but the man who once upon a time lived in the body. Back in the old world, he was a footballer who lived in London. They hadn't been friends, nor even known each other, but she saw him out and about. He was hard to miss. They had even met once. The realization caused her to lose balance and stumble back. Even though the pureborn caught her, the scene made enough noise to wake the Skinner. He leapt off the mattress while drawing a gun from beneath the pillow and firing a shot dead center in the chest of a member of the militia. Before the Skinner could get another shot off, Meg launched herself off the pureborn and smashed the butt of her gun into the Skinner's face. His nose immediately began gushing blood. She then knocked the gun from his hand and once again drove the butt of hers into his face, causing teeth to fly from his mouth and for him to fall back onto the bed. After he regained his composure and looked up, he was greeted by the rest of the militia. They had filled the cabin and were all pointing their guns at him. He had no choice but to surrender. It was about 8 months before the world went to hell. Meg and her friend Trudy went to Gallant, one of the hottest clubs in London. Their favorite local DJ, DJ Black Magic Rabbit Hat, was spinning. He wasn't just their favorite DJ. He was the DJ du jour of everyone who was anyone in London's party scene. Where he spun, they danced. Everyone who mattered was at Gallant that night. Cecilia Chesterfield Carmichael and her inner circle occupied a VIP table in one corner. In another corner, the body of the man who would one day become the Skinner held court with several teammates, unwinding after a match. Meg and Trudy knew some of the other players that were invited to their private table. It was there where Meg would have a conversation with him. It began with pleasantries before discussing their backgrounds and football. Trudy wanted to dance, and Meg joined her on the floor. That was the end of the conversation. It wasn't anything memorable. Simple getting-to-know-you stuff. He was nice enough, and much older than her. The thing she remembered most about him were the full sleeves of tattoos, especially the one arm that depicted all 4 seasons. If not for the tattoos, she might not have recognized his body so many years later. By the time she and Trudy were done dancing, the footballers had left. Meg never saw him again until finding the older version of his body sleeping in that cabin. His once chiseled physique showing signs of age. His once bright and colorful tattoos faded. His once friendly and welcomed eyes devoid of anything human, just vacant, soulless caverns of hate. Meg and the pureborn would have liked to put a few bullets into him, cut off his head, then burn his body to ash. But they had promised the Elder Council of Mount Hope that they would do everything they could to bring him back alive. There were countless settlements across what used to be Europe that would have liked to get a hold of the Skinner. But he was captured in Mount Hope territory. Therefore, he was their prisoner to deal with. Considering the large population and heavy firepower of Mount Hope, no one was going to contest their jurisdiction. Word quickly spread in all directions and to every settlement that the Skinner had finally been captured and was to be executed immediately. In fact, by the time word reached most settlements, he would already be dead. Before the execution could take place, there were people in Mount Hope who wanted to have words with the monster. First, the members of the Elder Council, then the pureborn and Meg. They had requested one-on-ones and at first were denied, but the ruling was later changed on the grounds that they were the reason the Skinner was no longer piling up bodies. Meg watched through two-way glass while the pureborn met with the Skinner in the interrogation room of an old police station, a station that had been revitalized for use by the Mount Hope police. The conversation was intense. Whatever the pureborn told the Skinner had an effect, a profound one. When the pureborn finally left the room, he looked drained and lost. Meg put her hand on his shoulder and asked if he was okay. I'm fine. I'm fine. He walked away before Meg could get another word in. She watched him slink off, then out of the station, likely back to the hotel where they had been staying. When Meg sat across from the killer, she had only one question. Why? Because I wanted to. And, well, for the first time in my life, I could. He told her of his life before the mix-up, how he had been a weak, powerless nobody, someone people ignored. When they didn't ignore him, it was only to mock him. He had been someone who didn't matter, someone who had been bullied relentlessly. I was planning a shooting, he told her. By that point, not too much he could say would surprise her. Yeah, was going to wait until winter. I had it all figured out. It's a bit hazy now after, so many years. But yeah, That was my life. Then everything changed. Bitch, you have no idea what it felt like to go from the body of a weak, frail 16-year-old boy to this. In her own way, she did understand what it felt like, but she chose to remain silent and let him go on. He continued with his story, telling her about how it felt when he found himself in the kind of body he had always dreamt of having, and in a world that had gone completely off the rails. All my life I'd wanted a body like this, so I could be the abuser, not the abused. And look at you now, he smiled, not a shred of remorse in his eyes. Look at me now. He spent the next hour telling her in great detail all about how he had been sexually abusing, mutilating, and killing since the early days of the New World and loved every moment of it. Took a minute to get used to, he said. I remember my first kill. Bashed someone's head into a wall until there was nothing left. First I was surprised how easy it was. Then I was exhilarated. No going back after that. After finishing his story, he leaned back, stared at the ceiling, and sighed. If only I'd stopped that bitch from leaving the store. He thought for a moment. Probably should have made sure of that one. He stopped himself. What? What are you talking about? What bitch? The kid's friend, or his teacher or whatever. If only I'd caught her. His voice trailed off as he stared off into space. Really thought the cold would get her. Oh, right. They sat in silence for a moment. Then he smiled. What? She asked. Oh, just reflecting on my life's work now that it's about to end. Your life's work? Yes, surely you've seen some of my work. Flashes of mutilated corpses ran through her mind. They were really something, weren't they? He continued. I guess you could say that. He laughed. Well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Isn't that something people used to say? Yeah, something like that. Meg had had enough, but he hadn't. You should have seen this one guy back around 5th year or so. Yeah, he was with a group of merchants, probably early NETC. They were headed west. He wandered off while everyone was asleep. Ooh, I really went to work on him. Watched from a distance when his friends found him the next day. Got so spooked they ditched their stock to cross the river. Lived off that stuff for months. He was laughing at the memory, reminiscing about his slaughters in the way most middle-aged people do with their teenage years. You really liked it, huh? He leaned forward. It's what I was born to do. What I always wanted to do, but couldn't for, well, lots of reasons. Would have been caught fast. Hence the shooting plans, go out with a bang or whatever. But in this world, in this body, shit, was like playing a video game on easy mode. Now it's game over. He laughed again and leaned back. Except I already won. 15 years and countless bodies. You catching me now is irrelevant. I more than accomplished my goals, fulfilled my life's work. I'm ready to die. There were no words. Meg was speechless. She had heard about sick people, read about them, seen portrayals in movies back in the old world. But to be face to face with someone who was truly, deeply sick was profoundly chilling. The memory of this conversation would stay with her until her last days. She was proud to have played a key role in ending his reign. Her thoughts were interrupted by 3 loud bangs on the door. Time's up, said the Skinner. Meg stood to leave, then stopped. What'd he say to you? Asked Meg, referring to the pureborn. For the first time in their conversation, the Skinner's face sank. Suddenly, the sickening confidence he had displayed since the moment Meg walked in was gone. Whatever the pureborn said to him had truly affected him. Ask him. Our time's up. Meg stepped toward the door and was about to knock, then stopped and turned back toward the killer. I met you once, by the way. Well, not you, but him. The guy whose body you're wearing. In London? That's where I woke up when all this started. London. Yeah, he was nice. I liked him. Shame what you did with his body. I can't wait to watch you die. The next day, the Skinner was hung upside down from an old, long unused streetlight. His tongue was cut out so he couldn't scream. Then the wound was cauterized so he wouldn't bleed out so fast. Mount Hope had only used this means of death twice before. It was reserved for the absolute worst offenders. Everyone in attendance was given a handful of rocks too small to kill, but large enough to bruise, break, and bleed. They pelted him nice and bloody. Then an elder whose daughter had been killed by the Skinner threw salt on his open wounds. Even though he couldn't scream, his eyes and writhing body let everyone know how he was feeling. After about 5 minutes of watching the Skinner suffer, the elder cut off each of his hands. With the blood pouring from the holes in his wrists, he didn't have much time. That was when another elder doused the Skinner's writhing body in old gasoline. After letting him soak in the pain for another minute, he was set ablaze. Everyone stayed until the fire died out. No one closed their eyes or looked away. This was something they wanted to remember. What was left of the body remained on display for 1 week. After it was cut down, it was left in nearby woods as food for the insects. Except his skull. That remained on display in the center of the settlement for decades. 2 days after the execution, Meg and the Pureborn began their journey west, back to Newcastle. Once out of Mount Hope territory, they and the 19 remaining members of the Brave militia joined up with a group of NETC traders who were headed to Portstown, with a few stops along the way. Despite having accomplished their mission, the ride was a quiet one. Meg's mind and conscience were clear. Even though she'd wished she could go back to her old life in the old world, she had accepted her fate. She understood how lucky she had been to jump into a young, strong, healthy body and find a life worth living and fighting for, even if she was stuck in the body of a man. Things could have been worse, and she was weirdly thankful. The Pureborn was a different story. Something was on the kid's mind. Meg knew it was the conversation he had with Skinner, but chose not to pry. It was none of her business. The caravan passed through Brave to drop off the militia members. Meg, the Pureborn, and the militia members were given a hero's welcome. They stayed 1 night at the Hotel Jojo and were treated to a royal feast. The gratitude was overwhelming, especially from the innkeeper Brett. "You'll never know how much this means to me. To all of us." The next day they said their goodbyes and were back on the road. Next, they made a stop at Watersway. Meg took advantage of the opportunity to speak with the leadership and let them know firsthand that it was over, that he was dead. She was once again overwhelmed with their gratitude, mainly from loved ones of victims who could now feel some sense of closure, especially the wife of the man who had been killed just outside the settlement, the Skinner's final Watersway victim, not counting the detective and his driver. The wife's reaction to her husband's death had stayed with Meg. It had been on her mind that day in the cabin, and later while she watched the Skinner die. Upon hearing the good news, the woman fell into Meg's large arms and wept. "Thank you," she said. "He meant so much to me. Knowing that his killer's been punished, well, there are no words." She wanted Meg to have something. It had belonged to her husband. He had acquired it in the early days of the New World. "He never would have survived the first day without it," she said. "Look at the stains. That's blood. Used this to fight off attackers and kept it close ever since. Maybe if he'd had it with him that night." She trailed off. The object was a miniature metal replica of the Eiffel Tower. Much of the area near the point was a dark shade of rusty crimson from blood that had long ago soaked in. It strangely reminded Meg of the Skinner's collection of knives. She thanked the woman and promised to give it a good home. "You know who would like that?" the Pureborn said once they were moving again. "My parent. Loves stuff like that. Used to collect it in the old world." "Here," said Meg, handing it to him. "Give it to him." Upon their return to the Newcastle capital, Meg and the Pureborn once again received a hero's welcome, their biggest yet. The Pureborn was hugged by the teacher, that quiet, one-legged woman who only spoke to him, and a few others. Meg found their embrace touching. Meg had never seen the teacher so happy or relaxed. Knowing the Skinner was finally dead had put her at peace. She only bothered to nod in Meg's direction, a quiet sign of thanks. There was no one special waiting for Meg, just her friends. After the welcoming party ended, she and a few of those friends headed to the old meeting hall for some celebratory wine, a fresh cask of new Bavarian ale she had received as a gift of thanks. She had earned it. The next day she watched from her window as the pureborn said goodbye to his parent. It appeared that the parent was hitching a ride with the net to Portstown. All he had was a beat-up old backpack. After hugging his child for likely the last time, the parent held up the mini replica of the Eiffel Tower as if to say thank you, before securing it in his backpack. Shortly after watching the net caravan disappear beyond the horizon, Meg left her room and made tracks to the suite that had for years belonged to the parent. The door had been left slightly open. Meg knocked and heard a familiar, "Yeah?" come from the other side. She pushed it open and stepped inside to find the founder all alone and taking in the scenery, specifically the walls. They were covered with tally marks, 4 vertical slashes and a diagonal across to mark 5. They were everywhere, not only on the walls, but the ceiling too, not much more than 1 inch high and 1 inch across. But over the course of more than 15 years, they had added up and nearly consumed every bit of both wall and ceiling space. Remarkable, isn't it? The founder, sensing Meg's fascination with the tally marks. I knew her. Her? You mean the body? It's the original inhabitant. Never told you. Never told anyone. But yeah, in the old world, I knew her. The founder, with his handsome Trent Steele face, was more taken aback by this than Meg would have expected. Seems to be a lot of that going around lately. Surprising just how small this world can be. What does that mean? He took a deep breath and stared out the window, thinking about something or someone. Meg had no idea. Then he pulled himself back to reality and returned his gaze to Meg. Doesn't matter. She's gone now, and so is he. Meg took in the rest of the room. Along one wall were stacks of notepads that she assumed had been filled by the parent. Along another wall were stacks upon stacks of old books. All these years she had thought Newcastle was low on books. It turned out that the parent had been hoarding many of them. What are you going to do with it? Asked Meg. Clean it out. Store the notebooks in case the kid ever wants them. Send the books to the library. Steph will be happy about that. Clean and paint the walls, replace the linens, find a new occupant. Then he turned to Meg. Want it? Me? Who's been a more productive and loyal citizen of Newcastle than you? I don't know. I feel like there's too much history. Yeah, just something about this room feels haunted. Yeah. They were silent for a moment. Who was she? I mean, who was he? You mean, yeah. Who was he? What happened? I mean, I have a pretty good idea, but can't help but being curious. Trust me, you're better off not knowing. Him, though, right? The Skinner? It was the first time she had said it aloud, but she had been thinking it since they left Mount Hope. The parent wanting the pureborn to finish the job. The pureborn being so determined. The interaction between the Skinner and the pureborn. The parent finally feeling safe enough to leave. It was all right there. I think you already know the answer to that. He started to leave, then stopped in the doorway. Think it over. If you want the room, gonna take a bit to clean it out, and I don't mind it being empty for a while. No, it doesn't seem right now, but I can't think of anyone else more deserving. Without waiting for a reply, he left her alone to stare at the ink-filled walls and ceiling. At random, she chose a wall and approached. She ran her fingers along the tally marks and wondered when those specific marks had been inked onto the wall. The parent must have felt so alone, so afraid, to have spent so many years living in isolation, living in fear, because he knew who was out there and what he was capable of. It must have been awful. Meg lost track of time and wasn't certain how long she had been alone in that room. By the time she was ready to leave, it was midday. As she turned to leave, she noticed something on the otherwise empty nightstand. It was a king, a hand-carved white king from a chess set. She picked it up and examined it. It was beautiful and very old. It reminded her of the chess set at her family's mansion, always on display in her father's solarium. According to her grandfather, it had been in their family for generations. She decided to pocket the king. No one would miss it. After all, the parent was long gone. The furthest they had been since arriving in Newcastle, finally free, heading off to build a new life. The thought gave Meg comfort. Meg would have liked to have kept in touch with the pureborn, but she never got the chance. 2 days after saying goodbye to his parent, he left to Newcastle, heading in the opposite direction, east. He never even said goodbye to Meg. When she asked the founder about it, he told her that there was nothing left for the pureborn in Newcastle, and that he had gone off to find his purpose. "Not an easy thing to do in this world," said Meg. "No, not at all." She never left the greater Newcastle territory again, retiring from field duty. Instead, she dedicated the rest of her life to building it into the greatest settlement it could be from within. Whether through breeding efforts, training the next generation of pureborns, or her favorite new role, working as security for the inn. There she would greet and converse with travelers from all over the territory and beyond. Probably her most welcome sight at the inn was that of the teacher, no longer afraid to go beyond walls, yet unable to travel far beyond them due to her foot. She became a regular at the inn, occupying a table in the corner where she read books, sipped wine, and chatted up the occasional willing traveler. In the years that followed Meg's journey east with the pureborn, she never saw the kid again, nor heard of his whereabouts. She also never set foot again in her parents' suite. She was perfectly content in the room she had called home since arriving at Newcastle.